You got yourself an early MLB Live Before Lock show. We have ourselves a 6-game slate that may quickly become a 5-game slate depending upon how the weather looks for the Mets at Citi Field. But I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man who's well equipped to handle this one more day with me. Another early Live Before Lock with my pal nerd-ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Good. I just like the idea that I'm being introduced as well equipped. Like what a way to start the morning. But yeah, so the weather situation here is going to be really interesting for the Mets Phillies game. As of right now, I think this is kind of where we have to start anyway, because it's very much the overarching theme of the entire league's DraftKings. Like, don't have to worry about it on Fanduel because deGrom and the Mets don't play on Fanduel. But for DraftKings, at least, deGrom is obviously, to me, the best play on the entire slate if the Mets play. But that's totally up in the air right now. So right now, I left that game in my player pool. It's not supposed to rain extremely hard at Citi Field, but it is supposed to rain consistently. So my feeling is if the game starts on time, they're going to play it just in the light rain the entire time. If it's a delayed start, it's supposed to rain the exact same way the entire day. So I don't see any way that they would just start it through that same rain later. So that's how I'm approaching it. If the game starts on time, I'm going to leave it in my player pool. If we find out it's delayed, I'm taking everybody out.
Yeah, and right now, Awesemo on the Awesemo projections, which do account for the postponement chance here, what Awesemo views as the postponement chance based upon his own amateur meteorology, as well as just the data that's out there. He has a 0% chance of postponement right now, and I would agree, looking at the ownership, going to be a heavy Jacob deGrom slate on DraftKings. So it does seem like currently you got to plan as though this game is going to go off and hope that we'll know a little more about it as the hour goes on. But we will talk with you about all that as well as everything else on the slate. So make sure to hit that like button, guys. Helps us out a bunch here to compete with all the other channels out there to stay ahead of the curve as much as we can as one of the industry leaders in DFS, bringing you guys great information every single day. So help us out, hit that like button. I will give you guys the top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel according to our ownership projections at the halfway point of the show, because money time never rests, much like me these days with the MLB show schedule. So make sure you hit that like button now. Give us a little love. And I'll give you guys the top 5 owned plays at the halfway point of the show. And also make sure you can get access to all the great Awesemo Plus tools and content for nearly every DFS sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. It includes full access to the premium content and tools on Awesemo.com, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, lineup builder, and much more. We also have a special MMA deal running for UFC 261, Usman versus Masvidal on April 24th. You get 50% off your first month of Awesemo Plus MMA when you include promo code UFC 261 on your signup. That's $14.98 for 30 days of Awesemo Plus MMA, which includes fighter projections, ownership projections, and a top fighter tool. It also compares the projected ownership with the chances of any fighter being one of the top fighters on the UFC slate. The offer is valid through April 24th, the Saturday that UFC show goes on. So get in there now with the promo code UFC261 at Awesemo.com/join. Stop guessing, start winning. Join Awesemo Plus today. And of course, make sure to check out all your favorite Awesemo shows on the Awesemo Podcast Network at Awesemo.com/podcast. All you have to do is leave a 5-star review for any of our Awesemo podcasts with you think your Twitter handle or your email address. Yes, that's what it is. Your Twitter account or email address on your review, and you'll be entered to win a free week of Awesemo Plus. So make sure to do that as well. And check out all the podcasts on there. All the shows that have any sort of shelf life end up on there. So give them a look. And let's talk about this first game here. The one that Greg just mentioned up top with the weather issues. Philadelphia, 2.7 implied runs against Jacob deGrom. DeGrom looks like the best pitcher on the slate by a pretty wide margin. Very generous projection from Awesemo. And as Greg mentioned as well, this game not on FanDuel, so it is more of a DK specific one. But Greg, in this spot, I guess just give the people one more time here how you're handling deGrom, how much you're getting of him, and I guess how you're going to handle it if this game does get weather issues or official weather issues that make it untenable to play.
Yeah, and by the way, something else, the FanDuel and DraftKings slates for the early slate, wildly different because the DraftKings slate has 6 games, the FanDuel slate has 4 games, and then obviously deGrom being what I consider the top overall play on the DraftKings slate should this game play. Not even something we have to consider on FanDuel. So I'm going to really quick also just bring up what the latest
oh, the latest
the latest weather report. Here, just go to Google. Going to go to Google, look at what the latest we have from the weather here. Also, if I look outside, I could see that I live not far from New York and it's raining. So the weather report calls for basically a 70 to 80% light chance of rain the entire day today. So light rain, maybe they're able to play through it. Maybe they aren't. But that's why also, like I said before, I'm going to base it on whether the game starts on time or not. If the game starts on time, the weather report isn't changing. It's going to be the same light rain all the way through. The Mets also had a disaster a few days ago where they started a game while it was raining and they ended up having to postpone it 9 into the game. So I assume that they're going to approach this game differently and they're going to be a little bit more cautious. So with that in mind, if the game plays, I think they're going to play all the way through. If the game is a delayed start, the weather isn't changing in New York. It's going to be the same the entire day. So a delayed start to me means that the game is ultimately not going to play. So that's how I'm approaching the weather right now. It's in my player pool right now, and I am certainly ready to take everybody from this game out also if I need to.
Yeah, and I feel like there is something too to the divisional games where it's just easier to tack on a doubleheader whenever in the season they so desire. So I would agree. I think there's a decent amount of risk, but definitely some risk that's worthwhile because of deGrom, 39% K rate over the last season and change for him going against a Philadelphia lineup that's got a 26% aggregate K rate for them. So the spot for deGrom looks pretty solid. You got to play it straight. And I guess, if we are playing it straight, Greg, there's going to be a lot of deGrom ownership going. Any interest at all in a Philly stack, given that they exist, they're a team, and they theoretically could bust up a deGrom day and have some positive results that nobody will be on, it seems, with under 1% ownership expected for that stack.
Yeah, so there are ways that I like to get leverage in MLB DFS, but usually it's attacking a pitcher who's not good that's picking up a lot of ownership, or the inverse where there might be an offense that's really popular going up against a decent starting pitcher, and I might like to roster the starting pitcher in that spot. Something I don't like to do is just stack against Jacob deGrom, because to me, I think that's a losing proposition 99% of the time. Even if there's a game where Jacob deGrom, off the top of my head, I think he scored under 15 DraftKings points once or twice all of last season. So on occasion, he won't crush on a slate. But even the ones that go poorly usually doesn't mean the other team is the top scoring team on the slate. He does pretty well to mitigate damage, even in his starts that are, like whatever, 6 innings, 2 runs. Maybe that's not a typical Jacob deGrom start. Like by his standards, that's pretty poor, but certainly not enough to be the other team to have a massive offensive output. So I'm not going to be stacking the Phillies against Jacob deGrom. I think there are every other team is a better stack today.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one too where I'm with you on that. And I think another thing that jumps out is normally when a pitcher does struggle something with power, does struggle with, hard contact, when there's sort of a signifier of, why you might want to go against this pitcher, even if he does have a good strikeout stuff. deGrom just really is one of those guys that doesn't have any of those holes. 111 ISO versus righties, 134 ISO versus lefties. The whip is low across the board, 0.91 whip going back to last year, 0.95 whip since 2019. Point being, deGrom, to me, I agree. Like, I think not a stack play. If you got any one-offs from Philly just because of the price points, I guess it's not the craziest. But honestly, guys like Bryce Harper, not priced down for this at all. Reese Hoskins, I guess, priced down a little bit, but still not particularly cheap. I'm with Greg here. I don't think the Philly stack seems the most worthwhile. The Mets side, though, does seem like they're going to have a good amount of ownership. They do have a decent chance of being a top stack, 8% chance of being a top stack according to Awesemo today. Going to be a bit overowned going against Zach Eflin, but Eflin does really struggle against lefty power, giving up a 255 ISO and a 6 xFIP to that side of the plate. And you are going to have 3 lefties hitting up top, as well as then Pete Alonso, who's not any delight to go against either. You have McNeil, Conforto. It's a tough lineup for a guy like Eflin, who has really pronounced splits, only a 2.6% home run rate going against righties, 5.6% going against lefties. This is a nice spot for the Mets stack if the game plays, Greg, but they do seem pretty owned. And I guess with the weather issues, in particular, maybe shortening a hitting game rather than shortening the pitching, I guess, though really both could happen if there were a delay and then the game restarted. How are you feeling about the Mets stack and how are you approaching them? Because weather can affect a stack in some ways even more or more egregiously than a pitcher.
Yeah, they're just going wildly overowned to me. If you look at our top stacks tool, like you said, they do an 8% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate, but we're also looking at one of the most popular teams picking up 12.5% ownership. So this is the team with the second biggest negative leverage score on the entire slate. So with that in mind, the Mets are a team that I'm very underweight to at the moment. And then, like I said before, also potentially none of them if we think this game might rain out. So right now, I only have a couple of Mets stacks of the guys. There are a couple of one-offs I like. Jeff McNeil, really cheap on DraftKings at 3,400. Jonathan VR, who's 3,200. Also, there's a lot of stolen base upside in VR. So he's somebody who, if he could score 0 fantasy points easily because he's not a good hitter, but all it takes is for him to get on base once, and then he's able to steal 1, possibly 2 bases, score a run. So VR could rack up fantasy points fairly quickly if he manages to get on base once. So those are 2 guys that I'm honing in on a little bit. And then Michael Conforto also at 3,500 as a one-off and outfield spot to me is a viable value option. But overall as a team, I have much less interest in the Mets than the field does.
Yeah, Conforto, I think, is one that jumped out to me at low ownership too, or relatively low, 12% for him. Pete Alonso too. It's kind of crazy because I know this is one thing that Awesemo tends to talk about a lot with how he approaches stacks, not wanting to cut out the best guy, the chance, or the guy's got the best chance of having massive production. And Pete Alonso here, it's going to be people really targeting the lefty splits for Eflin, but Pete Alonso is a 300 ISO versus righties. I know Eflin, as I mentioned, better versus righties, but it's still Pete Alonso who's got a ton of pop. I think just including him would be one way to get different with your Mets lineup rather than taking all the value guys, but that's just one that jumps out to me. And I guess, do you have any thoughts on that at all? I feel like Alonso is kind of disrespectful for him getting 5% when you're gonna have Conforto getting 12, McNeil getting 22. I know these guys are cheaper, but like Alonso's the one guy we know has a very, very high ceiling for his spot.
Yeah. So one thing about Alonso, though, is I'm really struggling to figure out what his actual talent level is, just because he was really, really good in his rookie season. He was not very good last year, and I just wasn't sure what to make of that, right? Second season, is there more data on him? Also, it was a shortened season, so there's a lot of weird factors there, but he's also been fairly terrible to start this season. So I'm just starting to wonder if I think it's very possible his rookie season is the best year he'll ever have. And I don't even know if he'll come close to that in another big league season. So based on what we've seen from him so far, I just don't think he warrants being this expensive. He has, 4 hits the entire season. He's scored more than 7 DraftKings points once. I think that Pete Alonso I think that maybe he just has some holes in his hitting that pitchers were able to pick up on after his rookie year, and he's yet to adjust to them. But I thought we could potentially see a bounce back year from Alonso, but so far it hasn't been the case.
Yeah, I mean, that's reasonable. I mean, going back to last year, just a 228 batting average, not the best. The power's still been there for him, a 250 ISO overall. And, I think I would still want to trust for now, given that we are still kind of in the early parts of the season, or definitely still in the early parts of the season. He's still a guy that has, over the longer term sample, that 300 ISO versus righties. And I would trust in Alonso here a little bit more, but I agree. There could be some things concerning, and it would be classic Mets, I think, in the way that fits the narrative of them historically, that they get the best year from the guy out top. He becomes their star. And then he just ends up being worse and worse, and they hold on to him for 10 years. I don't want to speak ill of a certain David Wright, but I feel like that harkens back to me a little bit there. But the numbers still jump out for Alonso over the longer term sample. So I'd take that stab today, but I think Greg raises some valid concerns there. Anything else for you in this game, or do you want to move on?
I just want to mention one thing. We do have Larry C in the YouTube chat. He asked me a question. He said, would you be underweight on deGrom? No. So, I mean, the only way I'm underweight to deGrom is if I think the game is going to rain out. If the game plays, deGrom is going to be in almost every single one of my lineups. And it's not so much that he's 100% or even 90% likely to be in the optimal lineup. It's just there's so much variance in baseball that the number one way to find consistent production is just from these ace starting pitchers that rarely have bad games. So there could be a time where Mike Trout goes, 0 for 4 and scores 0 fantasy points. There's basically never going to be that outcome for Jacob deGrom. I mean, he is every single game he pitches, he's almost always scoring somewhere in the neighborhood of, like 25 plus DraftKings points. And I really like getting that form of security because over the long haul, I think that just yields more plus EV lineups in MLB DFS. So I've always tended to really strongly favor the ace starting pitchers.
Yep, I think that's reasonable, and certainly deGrom going to be a core part right now, and one that got to watch the weather here. So that is going to be the most important thing we can mention during the show is paying attention to the weather in this Mets game because it's going to affect everything on the slate. Let's get to our next game here, and guys, make sure you smash that like button here. Really, for this show, any show you watch on the Awesemo channel, really anything you watch on YouTube, it helps everybody out in the YouTube community. Just to give them a like, more than you guys probably realize, helps out with the algorithm, helps to keep certain channels at bay when you have competitors who are doing the same thing, stealing some SEO, all those things. And that's the not sexy part of YouTube, but that's why we ask you guys for likes. So help us out, hit that like button here. And again, we'll give away the top 5 owned plays for free on DraftKings and Fanduel coming up at the halfway point of the show. And that special time called morning money time here. That would also be my morning show that I would have on CBS if I ever, one day I'll get that break, I'm sure. Let's talk about our next point. Tyler shaking his head was really the most hurtful part of that. You guys should all know. Next game, Miami 3.4 implied runs going against Ian Anderson, who will be the chalk pitcher. I guess whether deGrom is in or not, he's going to get even chalkier if deGrom ends up not playing due to the weather. Right now projects the number 2 overall owned pitcher on DraftKings. Going against Trevor Rogers on the side going versus Atlanta, 4.6 implied runs for them. But Ian Anderson, Greg, I think this is a really good spot for him going against Miami lineup with 6 strikeouts in it, or 6 guys who strike out above league average in it. Lots of good numbers here for Ian Anderson, 30% K rate, not the biggest sample size, but 2.2% on run rate. So he's not giving up a lot of power. Hard contact also being limited pretty well. well. The chase rate and swing rate, I feel like could be a little better for him. So maybe some signifiers that this number could come down a little bit, but going against a kind of weak Miami lineup here, I really do think Anderson would be the play I'm most confident in besides deGrom.
Yeah, I think Ian Anderson, really strong pitching play on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he is the best overall pitching play to me. If you do want some leverage, though, on DraftKings, I think Trevor Rogers is in play no matter what as an SP2, just because the price point is so cheap at 6,600. But on FanDuel, Trevor Rogers only picking up 8% ownership in the field, all going to Ian Anderson. I think Trevor Rogers is actually sneaky, really good. The matchup is brutal against the Braves, but I think there's reason on FanDuel at least to go to Trevor Rogers as a leverage play, because if Ian Anderson doesn't pitch well, it stands to reason that Trevor Rogers is probably going to pick up the win, and he only has a fourth of the ownership that Anderson has.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Certainly Rogers has some merits going for him that I guess we could talk about, but let's talk about the Miami side of things, because I know this is kind of the same thing we talked about with deGrom, where, I think there's maybe more reason to go against an Ian Anderson, a guy with a shorter track record who, maybe has some more dings to his potential here than a guy like deGrom does. But I don't really see a lot of reason to like the Miami stack, a 7% chance of being the top stack, but they're going to be 13% owned. As a value play, I guess you maybe would be getting there in order to afford deGrom. So that's the one thing I could see maybe getting Miami mini stacks, but probably not full stacks for me. But how are you feeling about the Miami stacks here? You have a lot of cheap guys going against Anderson, and I guess that's one thing that does make them pop, with a better chance to be the top value stack today than to be than their current ownership looks like on the top stacks tool.
Yeah. So, and we did just I just refreshed. We do have some new ownership information here. Miami, the ownership's come down a little bit, but they're still pretty strongly negatively leveraged team with 7% chance of being the top stack, and then 10% ownership share. So to your point there, I think the reason people are going there is because this enables people to pretty easily be able to pay up for Jacob deGrom, at least on DraftKings. FanDuel, then it's a little bit different of a story, because we have Ian Anderson being, really popular. On FanDuel, Miami's actually going a little bit under-owned. So on DraftKings, I really have no interest in Miami as a stack. On FanDuel, I think they're a little bit more viable as leverage off of Ian Anderson. I also think it makes a whole lot of sense to make four-man Miami stacks on FanDuel with Rogers as the pitcher. But that's also something where the strategy is pretty different for tournaments on DK versus FanDuel. For DraftKings, they're just going wildly over-owned. So I think that I would look at the DK situation. Like, there isn't even real leverage to be had off of Anderson, just because Miami, the ownership is already so high that it's represented.
Yeah, I think that seems reasonable. And Miami going to be now, let's see, I'm just pulling up the updated top stack tool. And it does seem like they are still going to be fairly overowned, as Greg mentioned, though a bit less overowned. Still definitely in the mix as a top value play, but I guess their odds of being the top value also came down a little bit. So Miami, an interesting team here, but probably not too interesting on DraftKings. Let me just paste this in real fast. Let's talk about the other side of the equation here for Atlanta, going against Trevor Rogers, who you mentioned some love for, and Rogers has shown some good signs. 32% K rate over the last season and change here. Only 170 batters faced in that period, so not the biggest sample size. And there are some concerns here. The walks and hits for him have been a little bit higher than you'd like to see with the 1.5 WHIP, but for the most part, not giving up a ton of power. League average 2.9% on run rate. So let's talk about Rogers first. I think that he looks fine here, and I think there aren't any numbers that are jumping out as too concerning. He's going to go against some tough righty power, and I feel like Acuna up top is really going to be the guy who makes or breaks his day, given the fact that Rogers has given up a 215 ISO to the right side of the plate. Not too much to lefties, as you might expect. But I feel like if he survives Acuna, it could be a little bit smoother sailing for him. You're still going to have Ozuna and Albies in the middle of the order there. But I think, to me, that's sort of the deciding factor here, where I definitely want to stack up some Atlanta, but I see what you're talking about with Rogers and the potential here to have some ways to get through the lineup. So which way would you lean here if you could only choose one, Rogers or Atlanta stacks?
Let's see what the latest data is from our stacks tool, where also I think we have to look at FanDuel and DraftKings pretty differently, just because the ownership in the games are so different. But at least on DraftKings right now, the Braves 11% chance of being the top overall stack on the slate, but picking up 15% ownership. So to me right now, they're going way overowned on DraftKings. On FanDuel, also going way overowned, looking at a team with 15% chance of being the top stack, but a 21% ownership share. So I look at those numbers and I like the leverage a little bit more on the Rogers side. Obviously, a very, very risky play because the Braves have a really good offense. Like you mentioned individually, Acuna, who, I mean, if he ended the season right now, it would just be unanimous MVP. I mean, they don't vote for this a week into the season, but I mean, even if you just look at the betting odds, he's come down from I think he was 9-1 to start the season. He's really down to 3.5-1 at some books now. It just goes to show how well he's playing right now and what people's outlook on him is going forward. But here's the main reason I really like Trevor Rogers a little bit as a leverage play is if you look at his strikeout numbers, really high so far to start the season, striking out 14.4 hitters per 9 innings. Even last year in a small sample size, struck out 12.54 hitters per 9 innings. Your point on the control issues are definitely well taken. And I mean, if he opens up the game by walking people, the Braves are probably going to end up scoring a bunch of runs and he's probably not going to pitch well. However, I look at some of his velocity numbers so far to start the season. Average fastball velocity, 93.6 last year, 95.6 so far to open up the season. Changeup velocity last year, 84.4, 87.4 to open up this season. So it looks to me like somebody, still a young pitcher, 23 years old. It looks like there's a pretty notable uptick in his stuff to start the season. That's definitely something that interests me.
So here's the question I would have, and you're talking about leverage here against the Atlanta stack, but Rogers himself is going to be 33% owned on DK. That number would definitely get higher, you would think, if deGrom is out, though I guess with this value pricing, maybe not so much, and I don't know where people would spend money then, but point being, though, Rogers is so highly owned, he's going to be higher owned than the highest owned player in the Atlanta stack. So my question would be, are you actually getting leverage on anything if you're going to have a higher owned pitcher than any of the players are? Because like I get the stack looks over-owned on the leverage tool or the leverage part of the top stacks tool that we have, which is always an important part of the Awesemo.com process here if you're getting an Awesemo Plus MLB membership. But I feel like, to me, just looking at the Atlanta side a bit more, I mean, you have a lot of guys who have really notable lefty splits. Even Austin Riley down in the 6 hole, like he's gotten his best results against lefties by a pretty wide margin, 320 ISO for him. Like, I think, to me, Rogers is so highly owned that I think going to Atlanta has a little more value than it would seem just because it's a short slate. And if Rogers does get banged up and has, God forbid, he somehow has a negative day in terms of his fantasy points, like that means Atlanta probably crushed him and was easily the top stack.
Well, to be clear, though, where I really preferred in his leverage was Fanduel, where Ian Anderson is the chalk pitcher and Trevor Rogers is only projecting for single-digit ownership right now. So to me, we're also the Braves on Fanduel, 21% ownership as a team. Rogers single-digit ownership. Everybody's going to Ian Anderson also. So that's where I think the leverage really makes sense.
Okay. And I guess that in terms of DraftKings then, do you have any thoughts about that? Because it's something that I feel like I haven't thought too much about overall with the top stacks tool, but to me, it is a difference though, where if the stack is going to be overall 15% owned, but the pitcher is going to be double that, like it seems like the leverage equation should change a little bit just because, and it's probably going to happen more on short slates than it would a main slate where you have 10 games or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because it does seem to me like I like Atlanta a lot. I get, according to the top stacks tool, they seem over-owned, but I think if you were to throw the Rogers ownership in the equation, to me, it makes them seem like they're not over-owned quite as much as just looking at the top stacks tool would.
Well, let me bring up, because at least the numbers I was looking at from before, Rogers was not that popular. Has that changed?
He's up to 33 now. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that has changed a lot. Before he had ownership. I think it was like 14% earlier. So at least based on that, I'm going to be, at least in the lineups I've run so far, this would change if deGrom is ruled out, and then I would have to, really rework all my lineups. But as of right now, if he is going to be 33% owned, I'm underweight to the field on Trevor Rogers, and I'm underweight to the field on the Braves.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. Just one thing I want to introduce to the conversation here, because I think on a short slate, you can maybe get a little bit more liberty in how you approach the top stack tool and the concept of leverage. And Rogers took a gigantic jump up in ownership in the run of ownership we got a couple minutes ago. So we'll talk more about that coming up in 5 minutes. So make sure you hit that like button here. I will flip the hat and give you guys the top 5 owned plays according to ownership projections on DraftKings and FanDuel. Let's squeeze a part of at least one more game in. Seattle 3.5 implied runs going against Matt Harvey. This is a double header game. This is, hopefully I got the pitching right here. I think I did. Harvey, terrible in every possible way. Seattle, though, still only 3.5 implied runs for them going against Harvey, which really, I think, speaks very poorly to them, but intrigues me a bit here just because Seattle still has going top stack odds, 8%, 6% chance of, or 6% ownership projected for him, but they do have a lot of guys who strike out here. So the question I have for you in this battle of the bad, Greg, which side do you want to take? Because Harvey's not going to be owned, but maybe you could cobble together some strikeouts against a lineup with 6 guys that strike out over league average and just 3.5 implied runs.
Yeah, the classic case of the stoppable force versus the movable object. Because I mean, this is, and it's funny too because yesterday we were talking about the 7 inning games, and I said that I can't target offenses in a 7 inning game, but that was also a decent pitching matchup between Nathan Eovaldi and Kenta Maeda, and it ended up being a spot where neither Maeda or Eovaldi were necessary plays for yesterday's morning slate. But neither of the offenses really did a ton either, at least from a fantasy standpoint, compared to the other offenses on the early slate. But I can't view this one the same way because the pitchers are both so bad. I tend to lean towards the hitters, especially because, like you said, you look at the top stacks tool, which, by the way, doesn't take into consideration the difference between 7 and 9 inning games. But even so, the ownership is low enough and the pitchers are bad enough. And it's such a small slate with only 6 games on DraftKings. By the way, this game isn't on the FanDuel slate. So just exclusively talking about it from a DK angle right now. I can't roster either of the pitchers here. And I do have a little bit of interest in the offenses. I'm slightly overweight to both of them.
People in the chat saying it's because it's 7 innings. That's not what I'm referring to. It's because Baltimore still has 4 implied runs on their side. So it's more Seattle, I think, getting disrespected even in the 7 inning game. But as I did mention that we had multiple pitchers to sort through. So I was aware it's a doubleheader, but still the total to me seems low going against Harvey just because you look at the numbers for Harvey, there is nothing that jumps out where you can even point to and go like, well, he's shown some signs of life here. Like, I guess the fly ball rate being 30% seems like the best thing for him, but 266 ISO given up since 2019. To lefties giving up a 290 ISO, to righties a 240 ISO, and then over just the pandemic season plus through today, 2.2 WHIP, 392 batting average allowed, and a 17% K rate. I feel like you have to have some Seattle here. Like, even if it is a shortened game, even if the top stack odds are not fantastic, though, I think better than you might guess for this kind of game. Even though, as Greg mentioned, it doesn't account for the game being a 7 inning game. The projections do take a bit of a drop, so that's something that I think sort of accounts for it. But I feel like there's still potential here for the Seattle lineup. Maybe more mini stacks. Maybe you're trying to capture the 1 or 2 home runs they can get in a short burst against Harvey. But we did see Boston put up 7 runs in a 7 inning game yesterday. Like, that's granted, that is Boston. This is Seattle, who's much worse. I just feel like taking some Seattle stacks seems like a move you have to, just because Harvey is there's just so bad across the board in every way that you want to attack a pitcher.
Yeah, but then the other thing I'll also mention about Boston is even though they put up the 7 runs, they still didn't equate into the winning lineups for the slate because it still ultimately hurt them a lot that they didn't get that final run through the order. That and they scored a bunch of the runs on like a Kenta Maeda error and some other weird stuff. But I still feel a little bit differently about this game just because the pitchers are so bad. So I have some interest in stacking both these teams from the Mariners side of the game. Everybody's cheap too. Like Mitch Haniger to me is the overall top play from Seattle. Other guys like Torrens, I think, is a decent catcher option, mostly because he's cheap and he's hitting in a good lineup spot. He's hitting 5th for Seattle today. We do have their lineup. So I'm going to be slightly overweight to the field on both sides as a stack.
Okay, that's fair. And I think Marmolejos too, a nice price point. Lefty bat who has shown some pop. I think if anything, he's looking to me like he's going to grade out as a guy who's just going to be all power and not much else. I think he's another guy I wouldn't mind going to 3,600. Wouldn't be shocking to see him take that lefty split advantage. 270 ISO for him going against that 290 ISO for Matt Harvey against lefties. But yeah, I just think getting a little piece of Seattle, whether it be 3-man stacks, 2-man stacks, or one-offs, I think would be appealing just because hard for me to believe that somebody doesn't get to Matt Harvey here. And hopefully that does happen in a way that multiple guys can get there. Let's do the money time here. Then we'll jump back to Baltimore and Marco Gonzalez, another bad pitcher going against a team with a higher implied total you might guess for a 7-inning game. But let me flip the hat here and refresh the ownership, and let's do the top 5 owned plays for money time. Smash that like button, guys. We got 480 people in here. No reason we can't get to 100 likes on this video early in the morning on the West Coast. So help us out. Hit that like button here. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you can know whenever we go live, including the main slate live before lock, coming up at 4:30 Eastern today. Top 5 on DraftKings, though. Jacob deGrom, number 1 at 62%. Ian Anderson, number 2 at 39%. Ronald Acuna, number 3 at 34%. Number 4, Trevor Rogers at 33%. And number 5, Willians Astudillo, 32%. Greg, out of that top 5, we haven't talked about Minnesota yet, but I feel like for me, Trevor Rogers would be the one that I would come in a little bit lighter on based on what we talked about. But right now, top 5 on DraftKings of deGrom, Ian Anderson, Acuna, Rogers, and Astudillo. Which one would you be under on?
That ownership seems very high for Astudillo. I don't think I've updated for the Twins lineup yet, but that seems very, very high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't get why he would be. There's nothing that jumps out in his numbers or projection, but sure.
Yeah, let me just rerun my like that's weird to the point where I feel like I'm almost missing something when I'm running my lineups.
He's cheap, I guess. He's 3,300 on DK, so that could alone be it.
I mean, it's not that he's not in my player pool. Just it's not like I was. If you were asking me who are the most popular plays on the slate, at no point would be like, oh, Willens asked the Dio. Like it's just not something that occurred to me.
Yeah, he wasn't in the original lineup, I don't think. The unconfirmed lineup. So because I don't have a projection from him in our first run of projections, but I think we have one in now. Let me just make sure. Yes, the Diaz projection is so he wasn't in the initial lineup, so that could be why you weren't getting him.
No, I have him. I have him on my play, just
okay.
not to the point where like he's one of the most popular hitters for me or anything.
Yeah. Okay. So that seems like a reasonable one to be under on. It does seem a bit odd, but I guess on DraftKings first base and catcher eligibility, maybe that can do that where you can put him in two spots, or I don't know, people are valuing him just because you can get him at catcher and he's normally would be a first baseman. I don't know. Let's do FanDuel's top five though, before we dig too deeply on that stuff. FanDuel's top five: Ronald Acuna, number one at 48%, Marcelo Zuna, number two at 41%, that high Braves ownership that Greg mentioned earlier in the show. Nelson Cruz, number three at 41%, Manny Machado, number four at 33%, and Ian Anderson, number five at 32%. Greg, same question for FanDuel: Acuna, Ozuna, Cruz, Machado, and Ian Anderson. Which one seems like one you'd want to be lowest on?
Honestly, I think all of that is pretty reasonable. If I had to pick one guy, it would be Nelson Cruz, just because I'd rather get to Acuna as my high-end outfield bat. But I don't think anything there looks terrible.
Okay. Yeah, I think that seems like a reasonable amount of ownership, and the Braves there do seem an even better play than they currently are on DraftKings. All right, let's jump back to this Baltimore game. We got 4 implied runs for Baltimore going against Marco Gonzalez. Marco Gonzalez very cheap in this spot, so maybe another potential value pitcher if you are not going to play Baltimore, though. And we talked about this yesterday. 7-inning game, probably not going to affect the pitchers too much, just because of the fact they're probably not pitching 7 innings anyway. Though Marco does go fairly deep into games, doesn't have a lot of great strikeout stuff, but showed some improved ability, I guess, to get Ks last year. A 22% K rate, which still under league average, but compared to a longer term sample size for him, up from 18%. So that's, I think, a positive thing going against a Baltimore lineup that with 4 guys who strike out above league average. I think, though, the Baltimore stack seems kind of undervalued here, and I guess that is going to be the case in a 7-inning game, Greg, but no ownership at all going to them. It's still a 5% chance of being a top stack. I feel like I don't hate the idea of going to Baltimore here, and I also don't really hate the idea of going to Marco as a very cheap play. I think this is a spot where you won't like the exposure that you have on either side, but I think you can justify it for both.
So in terms of pitchers right now, I have a very small amount of exposure to Marco Gonzalez. He's in 6% of my lineups, although I'm about to update that because we did just get the White Sox lineup and Tim Anderson's in. So that's going to shuffle around some stuff for me because he's not played in a while, and I was under the assumption he wasn't going to be playing. But yeah, so Marco Gonzalez, I have a slight amount of interest in him. I also have a slight amount of interest in the Baltimore side. Neither one of these pieces are core parts of my lineups, but it's something I want to get a little bit of both sides of. I mentioned Pedro Severino. Whenever he's facing a left-handed pitcher, there's always power upside with Severino, one of the better power hitting catchers against left-handed pitching, and also 4,100 on DraftKings, where we have to roster a catcher. So I think that he makes sense. Trey Mancini is overall who I'd consider to be the best hitter in the Orioles lineup, but he's really expensive, so that makes him a little bit difficult to get to. Somebody else who I've rostered a little bit this year is Ramon Urias, just because he has eligibility in middle infield. He's so cheap every single slate, and he's had a couple of decent fantasy games. He's coming off of a game where he scored 16 fantasy points. He did homer yesterday. So I think that Ramon Urias at 2,800 is a viable value play for the middle infield, which is a spot that's a little difficult to roster for the slate. And then nothing to talk about here on FanDuel because it's not on the slate.
Yeah, I think that seems fair with Urias. He was a guy I was curious if you're going to mention because it is very small sample size ball, but he's hit lefties very well, a 310 ISO and only 14 at bats in the major, so that's not anything great. But the overall numbers for him: 211 ISO, about 316 batting average, getting on base at the 370 clip. I agree that Urias is a value play, and because he's a second baseman and shortstop on DraftKings, does have some flexibility to move him around there. So I would be intrigued by Urias too, and it does seem overall the stack going to be unknown. People don't want to play the 7-inning games, but Going against Marco Gonzalez, definitely possible to get that production in a shorter run, at least for a mini stack. We're going to keep going through here, and I know this game was of interest to our news god, El Negro Loco, who is always grinding around the clock for every sport here for you guys out there to make sure we have the alerts. And it's part of the offering we have in the premium Slack as well. You can get notifications for NBA breaking news, and basically don't even have to follow anything on Twitter. You can just know at any time that there's news breaking. He is posting in there for you guys, so make sure to take advantage of that as well. It's part of all the packages we have at awesemo.com/join, including the express ones. So make sure you are getting in on that premium Slack as well. It's just a big value add to everybody out there. Next game, though, we got San Diego 4.4 implied runs going against Mitch Keller. We have a good amount of ownership going to San Diego on DraftKings, 20% ownership going to them. So that makes them, I believe, the highest owned stack, at least the last that I checked here. Still a 12% chance of being the top stack, though, Greg. And I feel like in this spot for San Diego, I might be inclined to not get very much. I feel like we've talked about some other stacks that I find appealing. Maybe mini stacks are better against a guy like Keller, who does give up a good amount of power to both sides of the plate, especially lefties. So you are going to have 3 lefties up top. I guess that could sort of justify it, but has a lot of ownership going to guys like Trent Grisham and Jake Cronenworth. And I feel like there's even Profar is going to have 29% ownership. I really don't love the ownership going to these guys, even though I get the pricing being appealing on DraftKings.
Yeah, and just because of this updated ownership, I'm going to have to reshuffle the stacks and what percentage I want of each team because on the surface, yeah, the Padres have one of the best odds of being the top scoring team on the slate, but it doesn't match what their ownership is. Like you said, right now we have about 12% chance of being top scoring team, but 20% ownership on DraftKings, so they're going wildly over-owned there. A little bit over-owned on FanDuel, though more reasonable with a 15% chance of being the top scoring team on FanDuel and a 19% ownership share. So Atlanta's still more popular than them on FanDuel, and they are about comparable to the ownership on the Twins. So the Padres do look they're going wildly over-owned. So certainly some guys I'm going to like as one-offs, but the Padres, a team that I had a decent amount of exposure to until this latest ownership run, I'm going to have to bring that down pretty significantly.
Yeah, so it's crazy too, and I think the ownership should be higher, but you still have guys like Tuku. I don't even know how to say this name. Tucupita Marcano, who's a name that I had to put into my sheet today because I don't know what this sounds like the most made up name. I feel like that whatever the lineups page I'm pulling from is pranking me, but he's going to be completely unknown. Campusano at catcher going to be completely unknown for the most part. This stack should be even higher owned, but because you're getting like 30% for the top 3 guys for the most part, you're also getting almost 30% for Ha-Seong Kim, who I know people love if they played Korean baseball over the early parts of the pandemic, but this is a not great lineup for this much ownership on a short slate. It's baffling to me. I get that the value's there, but this is a very, very steep ownership tag to pay in a way that I'm not accustomed to, even on a short MLB slate.
How dare you besmirch the name of Ha-Seong Kim? The
I gave him the credits, the laurels for being a Korean baseball alum.
Yeah, he spent most of his DFS career priced well over the 6,000 mark, and this is an absolute bargain compared to his historical pricing from the KBO. I still do have some interest in Ha-Seong Kim as a one-off. He actually is the Padres player I have the most exposure to right now. I do try to separate my biases from the days where I got my ass kicked in KBO baseball last year, because I remember them so fondly, staying up all night to lose money watching Korean baseball. But the price is still right, and he did homer the other day. I do perceive him as being a guy who has some fantasy upside until Fernando Tatis is back in action.
Here's a question in the YouTube chat, which I feel like you can answer pretty fast and maybe have some of your classic Greg Ehrenberg snark that we all know and love. But Caleb asking, I don't understand deGrom chalk. Although I'm new to MLB DFS, are we that concerned that Philly can't hit him at all? And then he also replied to somebody else in chat, to Dopey. Then, well, I get that. I just don't understand the confidence. It's not like deGrom is unhittable. And I'm just pointing this out not to make fun of Caleb. Obviously, if you're new and you're asking questions, it's always a good thing. So a shout out to Caleb, I guess, for just being willing to ask the questions out there. But Greg, do you want to give your take one more time here, weather aside, on why a guy like deGrom does float up so much? And I know this is particularly a part of your approach where you are generally paying up for studs as much as anybody I know in MLB DFS.
Yeah, I mean, to me, he seems pretty unhittable. To Major League hitters, he seems unhittable. Maybe Caleb just crushes him. Maybe Caleb's like a sneaky, really good hitter himself. But I mean, listen just the ERA numbers for deGrom over the last 4 seasons. So this year he has a 0.64 ERA. Last year he had a 2.38 ERA. The year before, 2.43 ERA. The year before that, a 1.7 ERA. So for his career, he has a 2.59 ERA. Also, the strikeout numbers are absurdly good. So far this year, 13.5 strikeouts per 9 innings. Last year, 13.76. Yeah, obviously everybody is hittable to an extent, but deGrom is about as unhittable as it gets. He had a stretch where he went something like, I don't know, like 27 or 28 starts in a row of quality starts or something like that. Like he doesn't have bad games. I mean, that's a little bit of a generality. You know, there's obviously going to be games where he scores, 16 or 17 DraftKings points, but in general, the floor on him is just ridiculously high. The real question here to me, much more so is deGrom hittable or not? It's what ends up happening with the weather in New York.
Yeah, that is definitely the biggest part here. But yeah, when you have a guy who's had a 39% K rate, a 21% swinging strike rate, actually 22%, 40% chase rate, like all these numbers scream unhittable to a guy. And of course, like anybody's hittable theoretically, especially if you're using MLB The Show as your reference point, I suppose, is maybe Caleb is. But I would think overall, yeah, deGrom, when you have a guy who's got the stuff he has, a track record he has, and also a sample size that's just there, he's faced 1,100 batters in the sample size I'm pulling. And over that time, he's got a 34% K rate, gives up under a 200 batting average, 121 ISO. Those are like crazy numbers for a guy that don't indicate a whole lot of risk. Sometimes he'll have a bad day. Many pitchers do, but he's a guy who does survive and thrive more often than not. And that's why those guys end up very highly owned. Any Mitch Keller interest for you going back there? Because to a much less comparable pitcher in Mitch Keller, but a guy who still does, sometimes glue together competent days. The strikeout rate for him, not that good over the last season, though. If you go back to 2019, he does have a 26% K rate. So there used to be a little more positive to him than people might have seen over the shorter term sample size. But any interest at all in Mitch Keller going against a Padres lineup that we feel like is overowned and maybe a little bit overqualified based on how people are treating him?
No, because Mitch Keller, I mean, we talked about whether Jacob deGrom is unhittable or not. Mitch Keller is the definition of hittable. Mitch Keller, who, I mean, before last season was one of the top pitching prospects in baseball, but it is just not equated to success at all in the big league level. He gives up a ton of hard contact. And I mean, the stuff is still really good for him. But I mean, overall, just looking at some of the results, like even last year in a small sample size, he had a 2.91 ERA, but the peripheral numbers are awful. He had a 6.17 expected ERA, 6.75 FIP, 6.57 xFIP. Last year, he struck out 6.65 hitters per 9 innings, walked 7.48 hitters per 9 innings. And I think some of that, too, is I think that he's been so hittable throughout the course of his MLB career that he's really getting skittish keeping the ball in the strike zone. And I think that's one of the reasons he's walking so many guys. And despite the good stuff, even if you go back and look at his minor league numbers, 2018 in AAA, 4.82 ERA, 2019 in AAA to 3.56 ERA. So it's not like he was just shutting everybody down in the minor leagues. So I just think that he's a pitcher that's just way too hittable at this point in his career. So my hope here is that the Padres hit him enough to the point where he doesn't have a great fantasy game. But I'm also hoping the Padres just aren't the top scoring team on the slate, because I think that they're definitely going to be able to score some runs in this spot, but just not enough to be worth what their ownership is.
Keller's numbers from last year feel like an aberration and like in a very strange way, where he had a 5.9 xFIP, but only gave up a 162 batting average because he got super lucky on his batting average on balls in play. Only a 160 BABIP, which is down from substantially from a 370 BABIP and is going back to 2019. So Keller, I think, due to have much worse performances than he even had last year. And that's not a great sign for a guy who definitely regressed from where he was in his early campaigns. Also, it seems like the news god is saying that the Mets game now in a delay, feeling like it's not going to play. So Greg, I feel like that's not great for what you've done in your lineup build so far, but any quick thoughts now on how you're going to handle that with the final 15 minutes? I guess 20 minutes we'll have until lock.
So we also just got the Indians lineup, but I'm going ahead right now. I'm rerunning my lineups. I'm taking deGrom out. I'm taking out the Mets. I'm taking out the Phillies. And yeah, I had 91% Jacob deGrom in my lineup. So this is going to change basically every single one of my lineup almost.
I can't wait for you to have some guy that we somehow bashed a whole lot today. That's the nature of Mlb Dfs. Sometimes you're going to have to talk yourself into those sakes. We talked enough about the hitting in this game and the pitching for Mitch Keller. So let's talk about Pittsburgh. 3.6 implied total for them going against Chris Paddock. And I'd have to say that Chris Paddock, I know our boy News God wanted to know about him earlier. It feels like Chris Paddock has to take a bit of a jump upwards because of not having deGrom and people just needing to spend that salary somewhere. Ian Anderson, I think, is the better pitching play by a pretty decent margin here, with Paddock struggles with power, a 5% home run rate over 2020 to 2021. Going back to 2019, a 4.4% home run rate. He does have some struggles, definitely has some ability to get strikeouts, but that strikeout rate dropped off the cliff down to league average last year, compared to 26% since 2019 for him at the K rate. I feel like there's strikeouts to be had in the Pittsburgh lineup. So I think Paddock would jump a good amount here. He was only projected for 8% ownership when it looked like the Mets game had a better chance of playing. The number is going to come up, but I feel like taking more Paddock seems like the move against a Pittsburgh team that really not anybody I'm worried about hitting him too hard. No guy over a 190 ISO in that lineup, and 6 guys who strike out above league average. I think Paddock might become a premier play just because of arbitrage, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like Paddock as a play on this slate just because, it's like Paddock was so good when he first entered the big leagues. And I don't know what's happened since then, but his fastball has just become really, really hittable. Like he has extreme issues with getting guys out with his fastball. And that used to be, he came into the league where it was to the point where, remember, he got shut down during his rookie year halfway through because he reached his innings limits. People were like, oh my God, the Padres just let him pitch. People thought he was going to be in the Cy Young contention. There was a debate whether him or Pete Alonso. And Pete Alonso had one of the best seasons we've ever seen from a rookie. And when Paddock first got shut down, there was an actual debate as to whether it should be Paddock or Alonso who was the rookie of the year at that point. So I don't know what's happened for him to go south since then. It is a really easy matchup against Pittsburgh. I assume I'm going to end up with a little bit of Paddock exposure now just because I am basically opening up 90% more pitcher exposure now that I'm no longer getting to Jacob deGrom. But I have very, very minimal confidence there. And I think that as a stack, Pittsburgh themselves, also a team that I'm not really looking to get to because they're picking up some ownership. I'm kind of scrambling to figure out what my stacks are going to look like now because everything just got rearranged for me.
Yeah, it's not a fun slate for you guys out there. And I'm personally praying for Greg here and for all of you guys out there. I did not play the slate because of the timing on the West Coast. And I'm feeling good about my decision now. Just host a show, have some fun hanging out. And also an important tidbit here from our guy, Caleb, now, our reporter on all things, all pitchers and their hittability. He says, now see Mitch Keller, on the other hand, completely unhittable on the show. So I'd play him. So that's now that we have no deGrom, we know we can go to Mitch Keller in confidence if we're going by the Caleb metrics here that we so desperately needed before the show.
Well, so the Padres, and now I'm gonna have to take some ownership. Like I'm still gonna be underweight to the Padres. But I mean, I wanted to have like no ownership to them before, but now it's like, all right, I've got like 20 minutes here and I'm trying to do this while I'm talking. So let's see. Padres, still so much negative leverage there. Can't get to them. So I want to be overweight to Seattle and Baltimore. I'm really just talking out loud here while I'm doing it. I don't know if this makes for good content or not, but I wonder what other people are doing. By the way, my pitcher exposures right now, I'll just read some of those out. The guys who I'm getting a lot, but I was not going to be overweight to the field on Trevor Rogers. I am now, though. And really my pitching core is mostly Ian Anderson, Trevor Rogers, and Lance Lynn. I do have a very small amount of Chris Paddock right now. And I assume a couple other guys are going to end up making it in a small quantity like Marco Gonzalez. Maybe I will end up now with a couple of lineups for Mitch Keller just for leverage purposes. Just because I had so much confidence in deGrom. I didn't even second guess it when Caleb brought up a counterpoint. I was just like, no, this guy, nobody hits Jacob deGrom, but now just everything was one way. Now it's another.
We got 2 more games to hit on, so maybe something else will spark that creative need that Greg has here. And you guys have a little extra time here. It's not. We'll be ending the show at 9 p.m. Or 9 p.m. Boy, it feels like it. 9 a.m. West Coast time, 12 p.m. East Coast time. So the slate locks a few minutes after that, so you'll have some time after our show ends. But Chris Paddock, I think, to sum it up, would jump up for me here. Doesn't seem like that's the case for Greg. Next game, Boston 4 implied runs against Michael Pineda. Minnesota 5 implied runs going against Garrett Richards. And I think in the speed, the desire to expedite things here because we've been distracted by the weather and all that stuff. I think the Boston stack to me would be less appealing, though. The top stack tool, I think, gives them more ownership than it would seem. I feel like they're a team that's going to get a jump upwards here because of not having the Mets, would be my guess based on how the pricing looks. But that's just me kind of talking out loud here, not knowing how that's going to be reflecting everything. But Boston stack going against Pineda, I feel like Pineda's been a guy who's also improved, who I don't think looks like the kind of dude you'd want to target too much with a 4 implied run total. So I'm more into Pineda, I think, as a play than the Boston stack, though. Really, I don't think either guy or either side jumps out that meaningfully. The Minnesota side really more appealing to me. Greg, how are you feeling about it? Do you want any Pineda? Do you want any Boston stacks? What are you getting right now?
I'm not getting to Pineda. I am getting to Boston stacks, though, and a lot of it's just because of that leverage score. Boston does look like one of the teams that's going most under-owned on the slate, and we get to a point too where, like, on paper, for sure, I think the Padres should be a team that does really well, but I can't justify rostering a team that's picking up 20% ownership. And on the other side of the game with the Twins, I think the Twins are looking like a great stack too, but they're also a team that's going a little bit overowned at the moment. So Boston is one of the teams that I'm kind of hitching myself to right now, just because I'm trying to find spots that I think have upside that just aren't picking up like a 20% ownership share.
So Minnesota side, I think, going to pick up a lot of ownership. It seems they are one of the top owned stacks before all the potential rejiggering that the Mets lineup not being in there is going to do for the top stacks. But Minnesota 5 implied runs against Garrett Richards, a guy who gives up equal power to both sides of the plate. 213 ISO overall since 2019, giving up a 200 ISO to lefties, 230 to righties. I do think going to Minnesota here seems appealing, even though Williams Astudillo, as we talked about, a little baffling chalk because he's one of the very few hitters here who doesn't have a ton of power, gets on base fairly well, but not so well that I think you're going to really need to get him into a lineup. He doesn't strike out, but that doesn't matter for fantasy to me. I feel like I'd skip Astudillo and stack up basically any of the other Twins. Cruz in particular, Kepler, I would also prioritize. And Sano, I think hitting in the 6 hole maybe gets a bit less ownership just from hitting down low, but a 300 ISO for him going against righties, I feel like is going to play well going against Richards. That's really all he has going for him is that power. But Greg, how are you feeling about it? Who would you prioritize from the Twin stack, or are you under on them because of the ownership here, indicating that they are perhaps a bit over leveraged?
Yeah, so I mean, the Twins still a team that I am getting to, and like I said, like I have Astudillo in my player pool, just not as much as the field has him. But I mean, some individual plays like Jorge Polanco, he's really cheap. He's coming up in lineups for me, so he's somebody I think to get to. Max Kepler, Jake Cave is I think a good value play on both Fanduel and Draftkings. He's close to min price. So there are definitely individual hitters here I like. And even as a stack, like I prefer them to the Padres, just based on the difference in ownership. We do have the Twins with slightly less ownership, but then also a better chance of being the top overall scoring slate team on the slate. So I think the Twins are a little bit more stackable than the Padres are, just based on what the ownership is. But still a team that I'm a little bit underweight to relative to what the field ownership is.
Yeah, I think I would also point to Ryan Jeffers, who doesn't have the biggest sample size, but has shown some pop. He's at a 5.7% home run rate against right-handed bats. And at least if you are going to him instead of Astudillo, you're saving $800 and you have a chance at getting a home run here. You also have a chance of him striking out a lot more. But still, I just feel like I would really try to pivot off Astudillo as part of the stack. If you're getting to a 5-man Twin stack, just take any other Twin besides Astudillo as your 5th man. Just seems like the ownership move for me. Last game on the slate, we have Cleveland. Actually, I guess before that, any interest at all in Garrett Richards? I feel like we breezed by him, but I just want to make sure we cover it because now there's obviously less options here for not playing that Mets game.
No, he seems pretty washed. I'm surprised that he's even able to still pitch with as much velocity as he does. He's a guy who's had elbow injuries. He's had shoulder injuries. He's had knee injuries. He had a year where he was pitching really well, and then he tore his ACL running to first base, I think, while fielding a ground ball, it was, if I remember correctly. So a guy who just has constantly been injured, but the velocity is still there for him, but the results just aren't. He's been really poor, pitching really poorly to start the year. And I just think it's the amount of injuries that are mounting for him. So it's hard for me to get there. And even though I'm going to be slightly underweight to the Twins, I still don't have interest in Richards.
Our last game on the slate, we got Cleveland getting 3.3 implied runs on against. Let's see. Actually, I got confused for a second because I have Seattle and Baltimore in twice, but that second doubleheader game, not part of the slate, thankfully. That would be a bit odd. Cleveland, though, 3.3 implied runs against Lance Lynn, who is now one of the highest priced pitchers, maybe a guy that picks up some ownership because of deGrom being shifted down by everybody because out of concerns that game isn't going to play. But Lance Lynn going against a lineup in Cleveland that doesn't have a ton of strikeouts in it, does have some concerning power in the middle of the order with Jose Ramirez, Eddie Rosario, Franmil Reyes. I think, Lynn, you're really just getting there because you want to spend the money on the slate, and Lynn's fine. 27% K rate going back to last year, go back to 2019 at 28% K rate. I feel like he's a guy that if you just, were panicking and global swapped over from deGrom to Lynn, I wouldn't hate it, but wouldn't shock me if he just has a mediocre day to day because Cleveland's got enough hitters to make it uncomfortable.
Yeah, so Lance Lynn was somebody I did not really have that much exposure to until we got the Jacob deGrom news. And now I have Ian Anderson as my most rostered starting pitcher on DraftKings. And then we've got Trevor Rogers and Lance Lynn are kind of tied for me, being the guys who I have the next most exposure to. Lance Lynn, what's kind of nice about him is he works so deep into games. And at a time in baseball where sometimes the workload for pitchers comes a little bit into question in terms of how many pitches will they throw, how deep will they be allowed to work into games. Seems no matter where Lance Lynn goes, his main value as a starting pitcher is, number one, he's quality. He's not like an ace level starting pitcher, but his wins above replacement kind of makes it seem like he is, just because he throws so many more innings than most other pitchers in baseball. So Lance Lynn is coming off a game where he pitched a complete game shutout with 11 strikeouts against the Kansas City Royals. I'm sure he's going to be super popular now with a lot of people likely getting off of deGrom. But to me, I'm going to be on him. But I also have interest in the Indians as a leverage stack. We look at our top stacks tool. They do have one of the best leverage scores on the slate, positive 3.6% leverage. They have about 7% chance odds of being the top scoring team on the slate, but only 3% ownership share. And now with a lot of even with that first game getting rained out, I think this could, in a weird way, lower the ownership on the Indians, just because I think so many people are going to be going to Lance Lynn that then people aren't going to want to stack against him. So I actually like the leverage here, both in terms of them going low owned and then also as a play against Lance Lynn. So that doesn't mean I'm not on Lance Lynn. It's just something I think to play both sides of.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's a lot of people who are going to go to Lance Lynn. I wouldn't say blindly, but mostly blindly just because they had that money to spend and it has to go somewhere, whether you're optimizing or just kind of building. If you were a hand builder for MLB, and bless your heart if you are doing that. But I feel like with Lance Lynn, I agree. I think that the Indians can gain some appeal, and I would prioritize Ramirez, Rosario, and Reyes as that group to try to get leverage. I think the 3-man stack would be more appealing to me, or, whether it be that exact 3 or any 3-man than a 5-man, because Lynn just doesn't give up a ton of production. But yeah, I think trying to get some leverage on Lynn seems like the move, because he's still a good pitcher, but he's not quite Jacob deGrom. So that's one guy you can maybe get some hits against. The White Sox, 4.2 implied runs for them going against Aaron Savale. The White Sox look to me a decent chance to be in the top stack. Going to be a little bit under-owned relative to their chances of being a top stack. They do have some strikeouts in their lineup, but Savale, not an overpowering pitcher by any stretch. Also doesn't give up a ton of power either, but I think the White Sox to me look low-owned enough to take some flyers on them as a 5-man or a 3-man stack. Not a great implied total here, just 4.2. But Greg, how are you feeling? Do you feel like the White Sox stack has some sort of appeal to you, or would you be more inclined to take some Aaron Savale at also very little ownership?
So one thing I think that's key here is Tim Anderson is back in the White Sox lineup and leading off. I think that adds a lot of fantasy upside to him. Something else also, while Tim Anderson is really expensive on DraftKings, he is really cheap on Fanduel. He is at, I believe it was 3,000. Let me just double check to make sure that's the right number. 3,000 flat for Tim Anderson on Fanduel. So easily the top shortstop play. And I do wonder if there's a chance that people might not be on him as much as they should, just because the lineup came out 10 minutes ago and the slate starts in, 20 minutes now for Fanduel, 10 minutes for DraftKings. But still, we have the slate starting in relatively short order, and Tim Anderson has been out basically since opening day. So I think that might lower his ownership a little bit, just because he should probably be like 50% owned on Fanduel at that kind of salary, and I don't think he's going to approach that kind of number. And then on DraftKings also, Tim Anderson going a little bit under-owned to me, so a fairly high priority play for me at shortstop. So White Sox, just based on that ownership where they are, I think it's a little bit too low. Like we said, they're picking up 5.5% ownership share with an 8% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate. So I think there are good ways to pivot off of the really expensive ownership of the Padres and the Twins. I think that teams like Boston and the White Sox, a little bit less chance of being the top scoring team, but you're also getting them for, a third or a fourth of the ownership, and there's not that big of a gap between them. So this is the way that baseball tends to be really high variance for GPPs, where, the Padres have a 12% chance of being the top overall scoring team on the slate. The White Sox have an 8% chance, but the Padres are also picking up 4 times the ownership. So more often than not, the Padres are going to be better than the White Sox. But in this situation, if you were to play the White Sox more than the Padres, it would yield a positive return over the long run.
Also, just to confirm, you think Tim Anderson's a good play at 5,300 on DK with 16% ownership?
It was lower when I looked before, but
maybe it changed. Maybe the ownership moved again. So I don't know, but
let's see. That would be about in line with what I have for him for ownership. Okay. FanDuel at 3,000. I think it'd just play him no matter what.
He came down a little, I think, in the most recent run, under 10%. So that seems more reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was what I saw before.
Yeah, it's like a steep price for a guy coming back in the lineup hitting leadoff. But yeah, I feel like a 10% is a little more justifiable. But honestly, on this slate now, you could play whoever, and I really probably wouldn't critique it very much. We got to make do with what we can here. Speaking of the four corners, I'm going to be recording that after we finish this show. So make sure to stay tuned for that. Fun preparing 2 MLB slates in one day, but that's a sacrifice I make in the name of giving away some free Awesemo Plus memberships on there too, of course, with our double dong pick. I guess it's one thing, Greg, we can close out with before we jump off here. A home run pick for you today. Who would it be?
Recent events would lead me to go Tim Anderson, except I don't actually think that he is the best home run pick. I think overall, probably Nelson Cruz, the guy who's most likely to homer. So I'll go with him. JD Martinez would have been another pick, but he's not in the lineup.
Tyler not happy as a known Nelson Cruz hater who believes that he shaved points in the Rangers World Series, if I'm remembering correctly. And Nelson Cruz would have been my pick too. But now, since you took that, I'm always too generous with the home run picks. That's really my big flaw, my generosity. I will say, you know what? I'll go to a guy that I mentioned earlier, Jose Marmolejos. So I'm going really heroic here, not picking a Nelson Cruz, picking a guy who sounds like he could be Paddington Bear's delicious friend. Marmolejos. Marmolejos. Anybody with me on that? No. Either way, that's my pick. Greg, give people the plugs. What are you doing next on the Awesemo channel today?
I'm just going to be making some marmalade sandwiches for lunch, and that's about it. Other than that, I'm going to be doing the NBA Live Before Lock tonight with our friend Eric Lindquist and all his silly voices, and then also the Jock Market show afterwards. I forget those, Spags. What does Eric sound like again?
Oh, well, you see, Greg, I'm excited to do the show with you later. It's me, Eric Lindquist, going to be on Live Before Lock. Not at the tip-off today because Dr. Ben Ross is going to be there. And he's probably more qualified to do a show with Spags, but he lacks the heart that old Eric Lindquist has. So tune in. So make sure to watch Greg and Eric later. I love Eric. Eric, a great guy who always takes my Mickey Mouse impression of him with such aplomb. Tune into the tip-off as well. Four corners for me. Follow at Chris Spags. Follow at G Ehrenberg DFS. Follow at Awesemo_com. We appreciate you guys. And tune into MLB Live Before Lock for the main slate coming up at 4:30 Eastern today. See you guys then. Bye.